So we're going to see how far we can get in finishing up Acts. We are almost there. And we're now in just direct narratives. They're easy to speak about and easy to read because it is Luke that's giving us the narrative. And you remember last time we were in an awful riot, and the people were so angry with the Apostle Paul, and the commander that was there, Lysias, he decided he better get him out of that ruckus before they tore him apart. And now he has decided that he's got to ascertain why he is being held prisoner. It'd be a good idea to know why, wouldn't it? And so look at the end of chapter 22, verse 30. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priest and all the council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So the Sanhedrin didn't get to meet in their normal headquarters. This commander sent for them to come to the fortress Antonia, and he had a particular place that he had lined up for them, and they were wanting to find out exactly what the problem was. Now he knew he couldn't beat it out of him. This guy's a Roman. And that's what he started to do. He started just to take whips and say, now, why are you here? Tell us. And but that wasn't going to work whenever he found out Paul was a Roman. And then verse 23, verse 1, chapter 23, verse 1. And then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren. Now, let's see. This is Paul, and he's looking at the council that's out there. How many of them do you think's out there? Well, we know 70 with the Sanhedrin, right? And the high priest making 71. Lysias, the commander, would have been there. All of these Roman soldiers would have been there. And Paul has an opportunity to speak. So I'm looking at it like this, as he is looking across and he's seeing everyone in the crowd. And he's looking into their eyes. And you would think, whenever he got ready to speak, that he would address them like Tertullian would have addressed them. Oh boy, can't wait to hear this orator speak, can we? But he's observing everyone. And he doesn't say elders, fathers, rulers. What did he say? Look at that verse again. Men and brethren. How about that? For a prisoner to speak. There are many who say that at one time the Apostle Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin. I don't know if we could prove that. But here, he just simply says, men and brethren. Do you think some of these folks were his classmates? Do you think as he's looking back, he was trained by Gamaliel as they were? He probably could call by name many of them, and he knows that his fate is in the hands of people that he's grown up with. And notice what he says. I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. I don't know if I'd start, if I was a prisoner, I don't know if I'd say, my conscience bears me witness. I have lived right before God. Well, the high priest didn't cotton to that, did he? Look what he did here in this next, and the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Do you remember when they struck Jesus? Very much the same way. But here, the Apostle Paul said, I've got a good conscience in me. And Ananias, the high priest, commands an individual to whack him. Now, it's a strong blow. I don't know if his mouth now is bleeding. and he is standing trying to speak. Verse 2, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. To be honest with you, I like that. Do you like that? Now, I know Jesus didn't answer that way, did he? Jesus said, why have you had someone to strike me contrary to the law? Contrary to the law. And that's what Paul is saying. But Jesus did not come across like the Apostle Paul. And something inside me says, yeah, go over there and bust him one, something like that. But he calls him a whitewashed wall. Have y'all ever said to somebody, oh, you just whitewashed that? In other words, it's still ugly down underneath there. What did Jesus say of the scribes and Pharisees? You were like whited sepulchres. In other words, you look pretty on the outside, but down underneath you're full of dead men's bones. This is a grave, a sepulcher. And he's saying you look good on the outside. And to the Jewish people, if they were walking about and they walked on the grave, what difference would that make? He would be ceremonially unclean. So you see, the whited sepulcher or whitewashed wall or whatever, and then the Bible here says, verse 3, then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law. And do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And then the very same comment that was made to Jesus, those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? And then Paul said, I didn't know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. Now there's the ruler coming through. But now Paul had not addressed them this way at all. And I'm wondering, did he not know Ananias? Well, now don't confuse him with Annas. Annas, during the time of the Lord, and Caiaphas, both had the title high priest. And if you look at Annas' family history, do you know you're going to come up with 6 high priests in that family line? Isn't that something? All within this family line. But here, the Apostle Paul said, I didn't know that was him. Maybe it's because they were in unusual circumstances. Maybe he didn't have on the high priest robe. Maybe the Apostle Paul's eyes were so bad by now that he couldn't tell who he was. That's a possibility. If you read Galatians, Paul said, I know that many of you would have plucked out your own eyes and given me your eyes. And then at the end, he said, you see what a large letter I write to you. In other words, he was printing it out in huge letters so that he could see it. Maybe his eyesight by this time was bad, but can you imagine of all the beatings and all the stonings? Do you think that his eyes, I have an idea that maybe they were closed at one time from the stones hitting him in the face. And I don't really recognize why he says, I don't know the high priest here, because Paul would mostly know everything that was going on with the Sanhedrin. How many years had it been? Some scholars say 20 years that he's been on missionary journey 1 into Galatia, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, Antioch. That maybe he's been on missionary number 2, Troas, Amphilia, and then down into Corinth and Athens and all of those places where the Apostle Paul would have been. And then the 3rd missionary journey that would take him into an area of Asia Minor with Ephesus, would be there for about 3 years. All of this time. And my goodness, the time of the travel. Wouldn't that have been something? So we really don't know, and the high priest would have changed many times. Verse 5. Then Paul said, I didn't know, brethren, that he was the high priest. It's written, you'll not speak evil of the ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, he cried out in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. In other words, Paul said, I give up. I came down here one more time to speak. I wanted to be sure you knew how to trust Jesus. But you strike me in the mouth as soon as I begin to speak. And at this point in time, I think he has changed strategy. And the strategy is to live. And he's wanting them to know about Christ, and he pulls out the idea of being a Pharisee. Let's read a little bit about it. Verse 7. When he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection. See, Brother John, didn't you say last week the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, therefore they were sad? You see, we were discussing that after prayer meeting last week. They were sad, all right. And if you didn't believe in the resurrection, you didn't believe in angels, didn't believe in the Spirit, I can understand why. And what else was it that they did not believe? They didn't believe the whole Old Testament. What did they believe? The Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So look, if you would, verse 8. For Sadducees say that there's no resurrection, no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. So what we've got the conservative party, and we've got the liberals. The liberals will say, we're not going to believe in any of that supernatural stuff. We can't have that. The Apostle Paul says, the reason that I'm here is I believe in the resurrection. I believe in Jesus. Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose again. Now, this is a good way for him to be discussing that. Verse 9 says, then there arose a large outcry. The scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, I love this now. We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. You're talking about changing the whole dynamic that was going on here. The Apostle Paul, this is one more brilliant fellow. Verse 10 says, now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down, take him by force from among them, and bring him into the barracks. My goodness, 2 days, 2 riots. Now that's really something, isn't it? And the Apostle Paul is rescued once again by the Roman soldiers. Verse 11 takes us to a brand new part of this saga. But the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. Jesus always knows when you need to hear from him in a special way. Jesus knew the Apostle Paul had prayed, Lord, let me speak to this group, that maybe I can convince them that you are the Messiah. But then he was met with a whack in the mouth. And then he goes back to the time whenever he was trying to wave with his hand to share with them, and they almost pulled him in two. I think the Apostle Paul is getting to the point to where depression would be setting in. And who came to visit him? Don't you love it? Have there been some special times in your life when you were in a real low ebb, but somehow Jesus spoke to you? Somehow he said, this is going to be all right. He said, Paul, you have been faithful to witness in Jerusalem. I know you didn't get the results you wanted, but you were faithful to do it. You also are going to speak in Rome. That's encouraging. The Apostle Paul thought, oh my Lord, I may never make it, but Jesus stood beside him. Verse 12, and when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Now there's you a good religious meeting. What do you think about that? We're going to see to it that this man doesn't live, and we're going to bind ourselves with this. Verse 13, now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priest and the elders said, we bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now they're going to get awfully hungry. You understand that? We'll eat nothing. Verse 15, now you therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now these men knew that if they attempted to do so, and the Roman soldiers are standing by with these spears, many of these 40 men are going to die. That's the strength of what they were doing with this binding themselves. They knew that when Paul started to come down to them, somebody's got to make the first move, and that man's going to die. Because these Roman soldiers, if they let something like that happen, it's going to get back to Rome. It's going to be a terrible time. And I look at that and I say, Lord, I thank you that you didn't allow this to happen. How was it that God providentially stopped this? Verse 16. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, I didn't know Paul had a sister, did y'all? And I didn't know that she lived in Jerusalem. I didn't know she had a little boy. I wondered, why didn't Paul go stay with her? Danger. Would you want to go and stay with a member of your family if you knew that you could well die at any time at the hands of others? Verse 16 says, the sister's son heard of their ambush. Providentially, God put this young boy at a place where, now how often would that happen? A young boy would be hearing 40 of the leaders of Israel discuss killing Paul. Only God can work that sort of thing out. Aren't you really blessed when you see a miracle? Got this question for you. When you see the providence of God, are you equally blessed? When you see God working through the providence of man and bringing things to pass, you go back and you look at the story of Esther. For such a time as this, Esther was born. The providence of God brought into being this brand new queen, Esther. And then, if you went back to the time of Ruth, the Bible says something like this. For Ruth, it was her hap, H-A-P. It was her hap that she should land in the field of Boaz. That wasn't just by chance, was it? It wasn't a miracle, but it was God's providence that brought her there. All right, verse 17. And then Paul called one of the centurions and to him and said, take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. And the commander took him by the hand. So I don't know, how old is this boy, you think? The commander takes him by the hand. Okay, son, come on over here and let's talk. They went aside and asked privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him, but do not yield to them. For more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you. Verse 22. So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, tell no one that you have revealed these things to me. God providentially, he said, Paul, you're going to speak for me in Rome. 40 men said he's not going to live another day. And God sends a young man providentially to take over. And it's just amazing what God does. Verse 23, and he called for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 100 for each centurion, 70 horsemen, my soul, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the third hour of the night, 9 o'clock at night. Can you imagine this amount of men moving secretly to provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor? And he wrote this letter, because this had to be done in the following manner: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix. This man was seized of the Jews, was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Now, he didn't make mention I started to beat him. He didn't do that, did he? And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council and found out that he was accused concerning questions of the law, but had nothing charged against him deserving death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Now, he is going to make the Jewish people make this journey of 35 miles into Antipatris. Antipatris, 35 miles this way, 9 o'clock at night, 200 men, 200 swordsmen, 70 on horseback, the Apostle Paul on horseback, leaving Jerusalem and going in the dark of night to Caesarea. Once they had gotten to the area of Antipatris, they let the other men go back because there was no really good place for an ambush to be set at that time. Verse 31, and then the soldiers, as they commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him, returned to the barracks. And when they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So that is, he's going to stay actually where the king, the governor, is going to be staying. He's going to make the Jewish people make the trip to Caesarea. And it's God is just orchestrating this. It is the most incredible thing when you see what God is doing. God's providential care and his care to be sure that the message of Jesus is carried from Jerusalem all over the known civilized world, and then finally all the way to Rome. Some people say Acts is the story of how the gospel left Jerusalem and wound up in the capital city of the world. And as a result, all the roads from Rome, Christianity would spread everywhere. Only God does that. 7:15, choir. And if you haven't sung in the choir and you're just hankering to, Brother Doran will be waiting on you. Is that right? Yes, sir. The blessing of our Lord Jesus Christ abide upon you. May you be in the center